Well, good evening, friends. Once again, that music is so calming that we are using for our intro, but I want to welcome everyone to what I know will be quite an interesting and enlightening conversation. Tonight, the topic is one of special concern for, I think, the entire world. We're going to talk about Russia. And to lead us in the night's great decisions discussion will be our own Dr. Medhi Noorbaksh. Now, Medhi is here with us, and we will wait to offer him his introductions as we, after we view the Great Decisions lecture that we're about to do. But most of our participants really know Dr. Medhi. He's an acclaimed international affairs expert, acclaimed around the world. So before we get started, let me just tell you to sit back. We have Zach Reed, who's one of our interns here from Lebanon Valley College, who will now be starting our video, and we can watch that, and then we'll hear from Dr. Noorbaksh. So Zach, you can get it started. Well, for some reason, we are not hearing the sound with Zach, so I'm going to take it over and see if I can share my screen and get this started. Let's see. I think this is it here. All right, let's see, share screen.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topics 1, 2, and 3 are non-traditional in nature. They're not the stuff of old-fashioned geopolitics and geostrategic struggles among major powers. For these next 3 foreign policy challenges, Russia and the United States, Myanmar and ASEAN, and the Quad Alliance, were on more traditional terms. Today's topic, of course, is U.S.-Russian relations. We begin with an overview of the Russian Federation. It is an incredibly large nation-state. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world. It broke up into 15 different countries, and yet the Russian Federation, which of course succeeded it, remains the largest country to be found. Its population is at 146 million. It is the 11th largest economy in the international system. And finally, and quite importantly, the Russian Federation is a nuclear superpower. So where does Russia get its strength? Part of it is leadership. Since the beginning of this century, Vladimir Putin has been the dominant political actor in the country. He has been quite stable and consistent in his leadership. even though there are many Western objections to his style and to his foreign policy. At home, he has kept that country together. Secondly, you have a very strong military, both conventional and nuclear. That gives Russia a great deal of global strength and presence. Thirdly, the diplomatic corps is impressive, and the intelligence agency is pervasive in the international system. The Russian predecessor, the Soviet Union, like its predecessor, the Russian Empire, had a very large diplomatic footprint that has not changed. And finally, Russia is home to a remarkable wealth of resources. It has more gold than any country in the world, more silver, more oil, more fresh water. It is just an amazingly large bastion of natural resources. Being able to access those resources is a separate question, but the Russians do possess them. This is the image of Russia and its leader that Vladimir Putin would like for the world to always see, sort of that rough and rugged approach, taming the wild bear that one would not want to corner. What is Vladimir Putin's strategy in foreign policy? The first is to promote autocratic or non-democratic rule abroad. Vladimir Putin will assist in undermining democratic institutions in other countries to gain favor with emerging dictators. Secondly, he is fighting in relatively modest or low-intensity proxy struggles with the United States. The Russians would not directly engage the Americans. We have devastating military power in comparison, but the Russians can try to undermine our allies abroad and align with our adversaries. Thirdly, he hopes to reverse the Cold War's end. Putin has spoken about the disintegration of the Soviet Union as an historic catastrophe that should be reversed. He can make modest gains along these lines, grabbing Crimea several years ago as an example, pressuring Belarus and Georgia, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, other examples. He's not going to be able to reverse, however, the independence of the vast majority of those countries. And finally, his aim is to undermine Western unity. As long as the United States is aligned with France and England, Germany and Italy, Japan and Australia, the Russians will always be in a secondary position. He would like to see Western powers divide, disagree, and separate. And of course, he is making every effort to promote that. Without any doubt, the Russians were promoting Brexit through social media pressures. And without any doubt, the Russians are promoting divides within the West European continent over issues such as COVID mandates, immigration, and EU law between Poland, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and others. So undermining Western unity is yet another part of Russia's strategy. Very meaningful debate happened in 2012, perhaps the most impressive foreign policy debate at the presidential level. This, of course, between Mr. Romney, the challenger, and Mr. Obama, the president. It was over the strength of Russia. Is Russia our number one geopolitical threat, or is it nuclear weapons in general, the Islamic State, climate change, or some other threat? And these two had a very impressive debate over where Russia fits in our geopolitical concern levels. Russo-American relations over time have been in flux. They've changed rather dramatically as the global context changes. This line we place on the graph we'll call neutrality. Anything above it would be warm relations. Anything below it would be cool or cold relations. Up until 1917, I would say the United States and Russia were largely neutral towards one another. They certainly knew of each other's existence. They calculated that into their foreign policy, but we weren't really engaged in Europe, and the Russians weren't really engaged in our hemisphere. In 1917, that would change because of the Russian Revolution and the advent of the communist Soviet Union. our relationship with the Russians became very cold after 1917 and remained so until the late 1930s. But we needed the Russians because the Soviet Union was a potential ally against Nazi Germany. It became one of the Allied members fighting against the Axis powers, and so our relationship was much warmer. It doesn't mean we cared for the Soviets, nor did they care for us. Very minimal levels of trust, an anticipation that once this war was over, the two of us will go back to our chilled relationship, but at the time, necessity dictated an alliance against the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. When World War II was over, our relationship became very cold. First, it was the atomic bomb, the advent of the hydrogen, the nuclear and thermonuclear, regional conflicts, global ideological disagreement. The relationship could not be any worse without there being an outright war between the two superpowers. When the Cold War ended, Mr. Yeltsin came to power and he accommodated almost every American demand on Europe, on NATO, on Russian behavior. This was a very warm period for U.S.-Russian relations. But then with the arrival of Mr. Putin, the relationship began to decline, get cooler and cooler over time, to the point that today I would say it's somewhere between the peak in the 1990s and the depths of the 1960s and 70s. I would call this a normal relationship among major powers. Mr. Trump showed a warming to Russia when he was inaugurated as president in 2017. Why would he do that? Well, in part because he seems to have a healthy respect for strong men, and very few are stronger than Vladimir Putin. The America First approach demands it. In order to pursue a foreign policy based on America First principles, you must convince your allies that adversaries are not as threatening as they appear. This allows you to justify retracting from the world. A recognition of common interests between Russia and the United States. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's been the norm for more than 3 decades now. Bill Clinton tried to reset relations with the Russian Federation. He was largely successful in doing so. The junior George Bush made the same effort with Vladimir Putin, as did Obama, and of course, as did Mr. Trump. In fact, I think Joe Biden is going to be the first U.S. president since the Cold War not to attempt to reset relations with Russia and improve our dialogue on a daily basis. In order to consider American foreign policies towards Russia, we must first take into account the question of rise. Is Russia on the rise? Number 2, what are its main vulnerabilities? And finally, what is the extent of this great power threat that emanates from Russia? We begin with Russia and its position moving forward. There is a perception game going on in world politics as it relates to Russia. If we were to ask Vladimir Putin, what is the trajectory of Russia moving forward, he would say things were very, very bad in 2000. That's when he came to power. But over the course of the past 2 decades and moving forward for the rest of the century, things look rather rosy. Russia has reestablished itself as a great power. It is reasserting itself in global affairs. It is increasingly ambitious and risk acceptant. If we were to poll the foreign policy establishment members, and there are thousands of people that make up the U.S. foreign policy establishment, they would probably disagree with Vladimir Putin on everything except 2000. Everyone agrees that in 2000, Russia was in a lot of trouble. They would recognize that Vladimir Putin did straighten out the Russian Federation, did give it strength, but they're not nearly as bullish or optimistic about Russia's power and influence by the end of the century. The trend line, however, is positive. When I look at this situation, I analyze Russia, and I'll call this my reality. I see very minimal gains after 2030 and rather sharp declines around 2040. I am not impressed with Russia moving forward. It is to me a great power in clear decline with highly recognizable vulnerabilities, and that is going to be a significant factor in our calculation of foreign policy options. What are the country's vulnerabilities then? Why am I so unimpressed with Russia? Well, it unfolds on all three of the most important variables for determining a nation's future. You might remember this slide from the very first lecture on demographics when I expressed how population is a very important variable for determining future movement. But for the Russians, all three of these are highly negative. The geography is not very impressive. I mean, granted, you've got lots of natural resources, you can't get to them. They're in the frozen tundra of Siberia. Insurance costs will drive you out of business. Infrastructure is non-existent. The river system is impressive in terms of linear calculation, but these rivers are not like the Mississippi, the Colorado, or so many other American waterways. Our rivers connect large population centers. It makes them perfect vehicles to navigate for trade. That's just not the case in Russia. Most of their rivers dump into oceans that no one would use, and they go towards population centers that are remarkably small. So geographically, Russia does not impress me. Geostrategically, well, when you eyeball it, you think Russia's in a pretty good position. It's at the top of the world. It dominates the Arctic. It doesn't have that many borders with other great powers. But in reality, there are four significant geostrategic weak spots for Russia. The first is what we used to call Leningrad. Currently, it is St. Petersburg. Very large, thoroughly impressive city, commercial center, large population, urban area, incredibly vulnerable. Very little way for the Russian Navy to protect St. Petersburg from a coordinated attack. Weakness number two is along the western boundary. Those are open fields. Panzer divisions could roll through them very easily, as they did in the early 1940s. This is an area of grave concern for Russia, and why I've always argued Belarus and Ukraine must be under Russian control for the Russians to have any sense of security vis-a-vis the West. Area number three, the Caucasus. This is that divide between the Russian Federation, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. This is a very real area of concern and a very long border to guard. And then finally, we have that stunningly long border with China. China, an economically more impressive country. Very quickly, China is developing a more impressive military on every level except nuclear weapons. And with Chinese demands for energy increasing, you have to think that Beijing is looking northward into Siberia at all of those deposits of natural gas, of oil, and natural resources. This border, however, is far too long for the Russians to effectively guard. These are the four weak geostrategic points of the Russian Federation. And then finally, we have the demographic question about Russia. It is absolutely miserable. This is a population that is disappearing. The government has intervened, incentives for people to have more babies. That has had a modest impact, but not nearly enough to avoid the demographic cliff that Russia is facing in this century. For these reasons, Russia does not, in my opinion, pose a growing threat in any way, shape, or form to world politics except through the possession of its nuclear stockpile. Population, as you can see from this graph, clearly in decline. But decline is not good, even for a bitter enemy of the United States. We can establish thresholds for each and every country in the world. The upper threshold is the maximum power that we're comfortable that country having, and then the lower threshold is the minimum power or strength that we are comfortable with. For every country, these thresholds move up and down the power level. For Russia, they're relatively high. But if it is within the upper and lower threshold, that's something that's manageable to us. We can deal with that. Russia today is in the manageable range. If, however, the adversary's strength becomes too high, we have to deal with it. But the good news is we can deal with it. Economic sanctions, military intervention. Saddam Hussein of Iraq became too powerful when he invaded Kuwait. That was not a difficult problem to solve. We weakened him back to a manageable level. The real problem is when the adversary's strength is too low, because there are very few levers at our disposal to deal with an enemy that doesn't have a solid base and begins the process of disintegration. Look at Afghanistan after 2001, Iraq after 2003, Libya after 2011. These were all grave foreign policy miscalculations because our interventions pushed those countries below the lower threshold, and suddenly we have countries that cannot hold themselves together. Imagine if that scenario happened in the Russian Federation, and it almost did in the 1990s. The Russian Federation itself was disintegrating in the aftermath of the Soviet Union falling apart. Unsecured nuclear weapons were a grave concern. There was an ongoing war in Chechnya, a war that the leadership in Moscow may not have even authorized, incompetent leadership at the top, and a number of near-miss second strikes on nuclear policy. On more than one occasion, Boris Yeltsin was approached with the news that the Americans have launched ICBM missiles, nuclear capable, against Russia. What, Mr. President, do you want to do about it? And when you have someone in office who is not mentally stable, who is far too oftentimes hitting the bottle, you do not want that question asked very often. And there he is in 1996 running for re-election. I never understood why the Clinton administration supported Yeltsin's re-election to the point that it did, offering very large IMF loans if and only if Boris Yeltsin is re-elected as president of Russia. Because he's an individual that was highly unstable and very difficult to predict. Here he is literally bombing the parliament in Moscow, destroying democracy before our eyes due to his frustration with those policymakers who would not agree with him. Moscow's grip on the country, very high during the old Soviet days, began to decline at the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, reaching a low point in the late 1990s with Yeltsin in power, only rebounding with the arrival of Vladimir Putin. But that low point is literally one of the most dangerous times in all of human history, because we wondered if the Russian Federation was on the cusp of disintegrating itself into a host of different countries, regions, and power centers, potentially with many of them possessing long-range ICBMs with nuclear warheads on them. What is the extent of the Russian threat to global security and the United States? We can place countries on a threat spectrum. In fact, it's not just the country that goes on the spectrum, it's the country's threats individually that go on the spectrum. On the high end are the nuclear weapons of Russia. It has more than we do. It has more than any other country in the world. It has well over half the world's nuclear warheads. That gives it enormous threat capability. But everything beyond that is relatively low range. Not overly threatening. We're not intimidated by the Russian army. There's not a lot abroad in terms of forces that the Russians can muster that threaten us, threaten regional stability or our allies. So what are American foreign policy options? Well, it begins with a series of questions. Is a new Cold War with Russia inevitable? Well, the answer here is absolutely not. I understand that we don't like Vladimir Putin. We certainly don't like the way he appears to try to push us and our allies around. That does not mean that an historically cold relationship must exist. Do we share common interest? Absolutely. The Russians are not after global instability, they're after Western disunity. Can we force the Russians into submission so that they'll change policy? No, we can't do that. That's a bridge too far. What should be our priority with the Russian Federation? No doubt about it, it's the nuclear weapons. Returning to the table, negotiating in ways that reflect both Moscow's and Washington's strategic interest to head off arms races happening in Asia and to begin to continue the process of lowering nuclear weapons levels. A soft approach? Well, this is a risk-reward calculation. We've been trying to reset relations with Russia for 30 years. The thinking is that it'll lead to cooperation in critical areas. This is what we learned from Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. This was the underlying feature of détente, which led to great breakthroughs in nuclear arms agreements. It could lead to agreements on regional conflicts and maybe even a new era of détente between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is the reward side of a reset. The dangers, however, are significant because if we try to reset and cooperate, it may send a signal to our allies that we're no longer in it for the whole, we're in it individually. We're going to pursue our own policy with the Russians, and that could cede at least some portion of Europe back to the Russians. So the risk-reward of a soft policy has to be taken into account. Sanctions against Russia, always an option, probably preferred to military engagement. We have to keep in mind, however, that if we sanction Russia for its bad acts, it is going to take that out on our European allies. If we're unhappy with Russian behavior in London, poisoning a dissident, or in destabilizing the Syrian conflict, that we economically sanction it, it means the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the French are all going to pay a higher price tag at the pump because Russia is a main provider of oil, gas, and natural gas to Europe, Central, and West. Cybercrime and election meddling are two of the most frustrating aspects of Russian foreign policy these days. The Russians are hurting us, and they have to pay a price for that. Russian cybercriminal activity is directed at American citizens, the U.S. government, the Defense Department, bringing down public networks that oversee our energy in critical regions of the country. And of course, there is the election meddling. I certainly am not going to contend that Russia has determined the outcome of any American election. I don't think that is the case. But I'm absolutely certain the Russians are trying. I mean, they should try. It's their job as a great power to undermine the well-being of more powerful adversaries. But it doesn't mean we have to accept it. The Russians have an enormous bot army. These are little electronic robots, effectively. They take on the persona of a real person, a teenager from Wisconsin, a construction worker in Florida, or a teacher in California on platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and the like. And they sow discord. They divide the American public. If there is a school shooting, within minutes, the Russians are on social media posing as Americans and trying to get the debate going about gun control versus the Second Amendment. If there's a riot on the Capitol building, then the Russians are going to be on the social networks trying to stoke the fires of patriotism versus security. And even on issues such as horse paste as an alternative to a COVID vaccine, the Russians are going to be there on social media stoking instability in America's open debate process. So how do we respond to these low-level threats? I think we treat cybercrime and election meddling the same, and probably the bot policy of dividing America a little differently. For cybercrime and election meddling, we're going to make it clear to Russia that they are guilty as alleged. We're not going to go through a legal process with them. We've already decided they've been hacking our elections and they've been undermining our society's confidence in its financial system for far too long. A short-term targeted sanction will be applied and then be lifted at the conclusion of 90, 120, or 180 days. We're making it clear to them there is a price to be paid for their cybercrime, blind eye they're turning, and to their election meddling. And if they come back and hit us again, those sanctions will return for twice as long. This is classic tit-for-tat strategy, which is found to be among the most effective ways for adversaries to interact. You punish the adversary for his bad acts, and then you go back to cooperation until they violate again. You're sending the message that their violations have consequences for them. Their behavior on social media platforms, I would put a lot of pressure on the social media industry. It has prioritized profits over American privacy and profits over American integrity for far too long. There need to be some very serious guardrails established for social media giants so that they can weed out the disinformation, the false information, and the Russian and Chinese propaganda that is flooding Facebook, Twitter, Vine, and all of the other social media platforms. This is widely recognized as a problem, but the American response has been very slow. Thank you, as always, for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, we certainly got a very good background, but it's a little bit, let's say, behind the times, I would say. It's none of us would want to have to predict, right, months in advance, but that's exactly what this gentleman has done. And of course, we know that things have changed drastically. But to lead us in our discussion now about where things stand with Russia, the United States, and the world, because now the world is very much concerned about Russia, is Dr. Medhi Noorbaksh. And Dr. Noorbaksh is indeed a world-acclaimed.
Oh, thank you, Joyce.
Well, you are. And we have known him, and we always call him for a run, but our community should know also that he is an expert on international business, on international governance, on human rights. I mean, the gentleman that we are about to hear from has written widely about international issues. And so I'm going to now, without any further ado, and I need to tell you, in case you don't know, everyone talks about Joyce as founder of the World Affairs Council, but Dr. Medhi Noorbaksh,
Oh, thank you,
the
Joyce.
founding vice president, was right lockstep as we started this organization at Harrisburg University. So Dr. Medhi Noorbaksh, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Thank you. Yeah, the same as you. I looked at, the presentation. And the problem is this, that when you try to predict the relationship with an unpredictable government, then you overall, face problem. And this is overall, the problem. But what I'm trying to do tonight, I want to take you to the conflict, because I think, you got some information over there. In terms of I have a couple of corrections over there to make. In terms of the economy, Russia is the 11th economy that was right, but you have to remember this, that Russia is not a type of industrial country. When you are looking at the strength of the economy of the the Russia, very much you have to think about oil and gas. The same as, of course, that Russia is number 11. And if I want to tell you, how it works, that that well, then Saudi Arabia is number 20. Because Saudi Arabia has oil and, of course, oil and, the sources of energy. In other areas, the only area of the Russian economy that is competitive internationally, that is military. Of course, they are the exporter of wheat and they are exporter of fertilizer. But more than that, when you come to the sophisticated, of course, industries in terms of a core, in terms of other industries, no, Russians, of course, are not sophisticated, and their economy is not a type of course, developing competitive economy. The presenter was overall right in that sense. I totally agree with him that the Russian economy will definitely decline in the future. There is one reason for that. If you want to be a great power in terms of the military, you have to have money. You have to have a well-developed economy. And the Soviet Union does not have it. Then the same as, what happened in the collapse of of course, the previous, we are talking about USSR, many predict that in the future that will happen one more time to Russia at the moment, because the economy cannot sustain that kind of military competition. And as all of you know, that was a reason. The presenter was right that the economy in Russia began to overall decline from 1980. And when it comes, of course, when it came to 1990s and 2000s, it got, the beginning of getting, of course, a little bit better because the price of the oil and natural gas overall increased. But one more time, not really an economy that can back it up. But let me tell you, something about the current, crisis in Ukraine. I think that overall gives you a little bit more in the area of what we want to know at the moment.
Exactly. And before you do, I was struck by his saying one thing in here, that Russia must control Belarus and Ukraine for it to feel secure.
He was right in a sense that both of them are a gate for the influence in Europe too. Number one, guys, and this is what I want to clear with you, the expansion of NATO was not really the cause of what Putin did. That was a justification. Mr. Putin had to have, of course, Ukraine. And many of you know that Putin have never recognized the government in Ukraine after 2014. And overall, in his perception, there is no such a country, Ukraine. You know that, when they categorize the Russians, they are talking about three categories of Russians. The motherland Russians are those who are living in the Soviet Union, in Russia. The white Russians are those Russians who are living in Belarus. And the little Russians are those who are living in Ukraine and countries overall, like Ukraine. And Putin is trying to bring the white Russians and, of course, the little Russian under the fold of they call it motherland. And motherland started, that concept from the Khrushchev area. I'm talking about the former Soviet Union. And when Putin came to power, that is overall the Putinism that we are talking about, to projecting power outside and overall thinking about bringing back what, of course, was disintegrated, that the author over here in the presentation very much in a right way alluded, to that. If you look at, Russia and look at, and talk to people of, of course, the Russia today, the Russians, very much for the majority of Russians influence abroad is very, very important for the national interests of the Russia. This is overall, the perception of the Russians. And from of course, when Putin came to power in 1999, 2000, he was the prime minister of Yeltsin. Of course, Yeltsin resigned. And since, that of course, that date, for 22 years, Putin, of course, is in power in Russia. And he tried overall, to do two things. Economy, and of course, economy is not really a well-developed economy. With the price of the oil goes up and down, the economy, of course, goes up and down. And he tried to overall resort to something else, and that is nationalism, imperial nationalism, to project overall, power and mighty military, of course, power outside this, of course, Russia, and in Ukraine at the moment, this is what you see. To expand the nationalism, Putinism, of course, outside, project power, and of course, added that concept to you that never, Putin accepted Ukraine as a separate country, and especially since 2014. In 2000, the Ukrainian elected a new government, and that government, of course, Yanukovych, he was pro-Russia. Then it comes to 2014, the parliament of Ukraine that is very powerful in the structure of the whole, entity or the polity, they put together a package together, an economic package. And that economic package, of course, leaned toward Europe. And Yanukovych did not approve of it. And there was a stalemate. And of course, in Ukraine, and the parliament of Ukraine called for a new election. Then Yanukovych, of course, escaped to Russia, and the parliament came back, of course, and overall kicked him out as a president and went, of course, for the new election. Putin calls this incident, that was, of course, people uprising and not accepting Yanukovych, of course, package and all of those, as a military coup. That is overall why, after 2014, he has never recognized the government in Ukraine. And for him, of course, Zelensky is a Nazi government, or the government of the world that is Ukraine at the moment. But there is something else. Putin lost the soft power game in Europe. 15 of those small republics, they joined Europe in different ways for two reasons: for their security and economic benefit. In both areas, the Soviet Union did not have anything to offer. In the area of the in the area of the government, of course, it was a type of dictatorship, type of government institution, of course, very powerful under the president. And the European, of course, they had to offer a type of democratic system. In the area of the economy, Putin, one more time, did not have anything to offer, but European had. European overall, if you overall get close to Europe, you benefit from the European economy. And Europe, of course, has a philosophy they call the third way. And that philosophy is really very noble in a sense. They argue that if your neighbor is a poor neighbor, then you overall face insecurity. And if you want to sell your product to the poor neighbor as a country that is producing, that doesn't work. You have to bring them to a level that they can, of course, buy your product and overall eliminate that insecurity that they have.
And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That is Joyce, that is a noble thing. Mm-hmm. That is an ethical thing, but at the same time, that is very practical and pragmatic. Because you take overall, your product and sell it, of course, in those countries. Putin have never understood, that concept. The countries that are Putin, of course, supporting at the moment, one of them is Belarus. The economy is not developed. The government, of course, is a type of, dictatorship. And Kazakhstan. Look at Kazakhstan. This is second model of, Mr. Putin, the same as overall, former Soviet Union. This is overall, the countries that he supported. But in Ukraine since 2014, not only the people, little by little, more of the people, and of course, the establishment, they lean toward, of course, Europe. Putin didn't like this, idea. Anyway,
right.
He made 5 miscalculations, and Joyce, I finished with those miscalculations.
All right, I want to hear these, yes.
Yeah, number one, he didn't think that Europe can, of course, unified one more time. But since Biden came to power, one of the things that Biden did, Biden tried to bring, of course, Europe together, because Europe, as you know, was weakened. I'm talking about the European Union, was weakened under the Trump administration. That was the first thing, of course, that Biden did. And Biden had a good reputation in Europe. because he was really a type of leader that they accepted him as a world leader. That was, of course, the first miscalculation that Mr. Putin did. He did not that, he didn't know that Europe comes together very quickly in a matter of course, a few days. Number two, overall, he did not think that the sanction goes that far. You know that, there are two pipelines, natural gas pipelines. One, it comes, of course, to Ukraine, Nord Stream 1. And the second one, of course, was Nord Stream 2. Biden administration disagreed with Merkel for this, project, but Merkel did not agree with Biden and they continued. But as soon as they, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, they stopped that project. And that was a huge loss to Russia and Putin never thought that, that thing, would happen. Sure. In that presentation tonight, that was one of the miscalculation of the presenter that alluded to this, that, that is critical or that is nuisance. So in terms of the energy, but that Biden is working on it in the last couple of days, in the couple of weeks, last 10 days, the price of gasoline in this country dropped 20-25%. Yeah. Because they are trying to gather the resources here and there. In some Western countries, they are saving. In Japan, for example, they are saving natural gas in order to send it to Europe. In Qatar, Joyce, Qatar was selling 15% of its natural gas on a spot, but now they are not selling it on a spot. They are sending it to Europe. Then they are trying to work it out. They are talking about it. Right. Then number two overall, was the extension and the expanse of course, sanction that Mr. Putin never, thought about it that way. Number three, Mr. Putin thought, and European unfortunately thought, this way, that he goes, or his military goes to Ukraine, and they can overall, take the country in 1 week. And that is the end of the story. And the goal overall was to take over Kiev and topple, the government. Zelensky stood over there, galvanized overall, the whole, country. They are defeating Russians, at the moment. Of course, Russians made, come back in, some cities, but that is the end of Russia in the sense that they can, take the country, or they can overall, inflict more damage, more than, what they have done, for example, in Mariupol, that what they have done. And Russia, of course, under Putin, there are three examples of that kind of savagery. One, of course, in Grozny in Chechnya, that they flattened overall, the city. Putin killed 300,000 Muslims to take over, the country. That kind, of course, gained independence. Now, example number two is Aleppo in Syria. That is, of course, the next example. And the example three at the moment is Mariupol. If you look at it, the way he fought, this people and the cities are exactly the same. Anyway, Ukrainian unity, it was amazing. And the first 2-3 days, the European also would have, they were thinking that the Russians come in, they take over the country. They did not, support that much the Ukrainian, because they were afraid that Russians come in and take away all of the modern military equipment that they have given to Ukraine. But they of course, they were proven wrong, and now they are supporting, of course, Ukraine. Number four, of course, he didn't know that for the self-determination, we are talking about election and those things, people of the world, they unite. Yeah. And that unification is, Joyce, very important. Why? They put pressure on their governments to support Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And can you believe that the countries in Europe that never participate in that type of activities, like, for example, Switzerland, they are sending military and support overall to Ukraine. And number five, and finally, I want to finish with this and allow, of course, my audience to ask question. In terms of the military planning, Mr. Putin did a miserable job. They were thinking that, they can capture the whole, country less than a week. They did not have support system. They did not have enough food. They did not have enough energy. I'm sorry, gas for, for their tanks and others. And because of that, there are two ways overall that, the wars are waged. Number one, command and control is centralized. And you from a center, you conduct the war. Number two, in that case, in the case of Putin, they did, of course, horizontally. Horizontally means they sent generals over there because they didn't know that Ukrainian stand against them. Joyce, so far, 8 Russian generals have been killed overall, in that war. Close to about 2,000 pieces of equipment. They were captured from the Russians. In some cities, they kicked, of course, out, or they pushed, overall, back. The prediction that is that, the Russians in the next couple of days, they may come back for some other areas, but Ukrainians are ready. Of course, the Western countries are ready. And one more thing, of course, at the end, that the European, of course, they are fighting for themselves too.
Well, that's the point.
Absolutely, that's the point.
Exactly right.
It's not only the Ukraine, because they know that if Russia captures Ukraine, that is a dangerous overall, thing for the whole Europe.
Absolutely.
In terms of destabilizing democratic institutions, international institutions, and that is overall, something that you have to think about. I'm sorry.
Well, as usual, you have given us a brilliant analysis.
Oh, thank you very much, Joyce. I wanted to take you to the conflict because the presentation was overall, before the conflict.
No, well, exactly. Yes, his was very much outdated, and we saw. But I lived, as you well know, for 5 years in the Czech Republic.
Yeah,
and I know that they are terrified of what it means for the rest. Estonia, Latvia, all those in the Baltics
small countries
are terrified because they know this man will not stop if he were to be successful in Ukraine. But let me ask you this. Has this also underscored another issue? Despotism is far weaker. There is an inherent weakness in it, in that people don't tell you the truth when you're the leader. I mean, one of the things we're hearing now is that Putin hasn't been getting the truth. He probably got the truth. Remember, he had a falling out with his intelligence chief?
Yeah.
That intelligence chief was trying to tell him it's not going to be a cakewalk in Ukraine.
No.
And he refused to hear it.
Dictators are the enemies of themselves.
Exactly.
You know that is a discussion at the moment that some of the generals misled Putin, not intentionally, because they didn't know how to talk with him.
Exactly.
He was not ready to accept, the truth. And now he is paying the price for it. Joyce, something else that, I add over here. This war in the power structure of Russia is not popular.
Right.
It has a lot of course, opposition. Yesterday, I was reading 2 pieces and I went overall to investigate a little bit. There are people who are spying for Ukraine in Kremlin at the moment.
Yeah, I can believe that.
They
Absolutely.
give them information. Last week, Putin sent a group of 25 commanders to assassinate Zelensky. And they informed Zelensky before that group went over there.
Right.
Because that war for them also, because there are some Russians, of course, in Ukraine, is not acceptable by any standard for a lot of Russians, of course.
Right.
It has, of course, the majority of Russians, of course, supporting Putin now, but God knows, what happens tomorrow. Yeah.
Well, getting back to our analysis earlier, it shows how, you can really be, when you don't have all the facts, you can be blind, because what we see here is that this move by Putin is not only going to destroy the economy of Russia, but it is going to divide the Russian people.
Oh,
it
absolutely.
will be at least a decade before they get back to where they are, where they were before this. And I'm talking about even if they succeed, they will be succeeding in taking over an absolutely destroyed pile of rubble the way they're doing it.
You're absolutely right. After this war, Europe comes back to rebuild Ukraine. For the Ukrainian, the sacrifice was, of course, worth it. Why? Because with that war, Ukrainian got their independence.
Yeah.
Never, ever again, Russians, of course, attack Ukraine. Yeah. For Russians, of course, the burden of sanctions for many, many years to come, overall, it ruins their economy. And there are a lot of speculation, Joyce, at the moment, that they will not tolerate later on. They do not know that much about it now. But as soon as, of course, sanctions kick in, and you have under the pressure, of course, economies under the pressure, the prices, goes up, there are shortages, then they cannot tolerate, Putin, because Putin made, that crisis for the Russians, and he himself, of course, is responsible.
Absolutely. Oh, okay. So I'm going to go into some difficult territory now, and then I'm going to take some questions. And this is the question I want to ask you that's so controversial. But okay, we heard our president basically say, this man can't be allowed to stay in power, right? And yet he was saying what a lot of people were thinking, right? Can Putin be taken out? That's the question. Is there someone around him? And let me tell you, I listened to a session with Condoleezza Rice, who seemed to be sending signals in her conversation. She didn't do it as outwardly as Biden, but that said, clearly the generals or people around him are able to manage things. So, I mean,
the signal from the West at the moment is, you take care of it and you will have a good relation with us. That is it. But in terms of, direct involvement in anything, the CIA agent or anything in that regard, no, I really do not think so. But there are enough people that are dissatisfied. That oligarch in Russia at the moment, many of them are really hurt. Yeah. They're billions of dollars under, sanction here and there, they're hurt. And very much, maybe, Joyce, we do not know yet. And as I said, as the sanctions kick in and the economic pressure, of course, increases in Russia, then dissent and opposition very much find a new way to oppose, that dictator.
Right. Well, one of the things I remember when she was discussing, the question was asked, could the oligarchs get through to him and make him pull back and make him stop? And she said, no, she didn't think they had that kind of influence, but the generals might be able to get.
Yeah, no, he's right. He's right. She's absolutely right. That, one of those oligarchs that is trying really to get to Putin is Abramovich, who had the Chelsea in London. And he's part of the negotiation at the moment in Istanbul. He's the only one. But something, Joyce, that is amazing. The people from Ukraine who are going for negotiation are from all of the parties in Ukraine, not the Zelensky's party. The opposition parties also. Can you believe this?
Yeah, I can't believe it, because nothing unites you as much as the threat of death. I mean, that's what they're doing, right?
Putin is fighting in Russia, in Ukraine, for the domination of what is called Russians. Mm-hmm. Zelensky is fighting against him back on the basis of the right of the citizenship. There are two different things.
Very good.
Do you know what I'm talking about? There are two different things.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, this will, if once they get out of this, Ukraine, I do believe Ukraine will survive.
Absolutely.
I really do believe.
Absolutely.
And that Russia will have learned a lesson that will last us a decade or more, or a century or more.
Absolutely.
But let me get some questions so we can do here. One of the questions is, given the hit the Russian economy has taken, how long do you think it would take for it to recover and stabilize? And what could be the repercussions? Remember the guy talked about, don't make your enemy too weak. What could be the repercussions of a really hurt Russia?
Change of regime, perhaps, because Putin has been over there for 22 years. perhaps a new history, a new, of course, new start in Russia. You know that after 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was the speculation that a lot of countries, they democratize and they take advantage of the globalization. But Mr. Putin did not do that. Mr. Putin, of course, turned around and very much, of course, established a foundation of an authoritarian regime. And in terms of the economy, he did not take advantage of developing a type of industrialized economy. And for a while, there was a discussion that this economy with a military competition cannot sustain, itself. And now with the sanctions, that process overall, will be absolutely, will be very much, of course, you cannot think about, a long time if sanctions, of course, kick in and put a lot of pressure on Russia.
Here's a great question Roxana is asking, and thank you for that question, Roxana. She says, if Putin is taken out, which is something to think about, yeah. Who are the possible candidates to lead Russia? Who would step in? That's fascinating to think.
Yeah, the military is on. If something happens to Putin, it has to come from military. And later on, if military is decent enough, I saw one name a couple of days ago. I forgot, the name. I'm sorry. If military will be decent, they go for opposition and a type of government. I'm talking about Navalny. Not Navalny as a leader, but perhaps within the frame of a type of pluralistic, inclusive, government. I
hate to think of what Navalny is going through now, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know that, because Navalny condemned the invasion of Ukraine, they gave him another 8 years in the jail.
Yeah.
Another 8 years.
I'm surprised he's still alive, to be honest.
Yeah.
I really am. But I want to get into this other question here about the ethnicity and this culture. Okay. Many Ukrainians, and I'm talking to many in this country who have families there, they can't believe Russia is bombing them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they felt such kinship, such same culture, same people, same raceness. What happened there? How is it that Putin doesn't feel that?
A crazy man, Joyce. There is nothing overall, nothing else to think about. 20% of the Ukrainian are Russian. They are from Russia. And as you said it, the rest of them have affinity in terms of the language. You know that, the Orthodox Christian faith has, of course, root in Ukraine too. Yeah. And this is amazing that the Orthodox Church took the side of Putin. I'm talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, took the side of Putin and very much are supporting that war in Ukraine. And they lost a lot of people who are in the same, the same faith. I was talking to a couple of people, last week. Russians who are living in Ukraine, they are absolutely opposing what Putin is.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Absolutely opposing.
Well, I was going to say, I spoke just yesterday to a Russian who is a bishop, a Christian bishop there.
Yeah.
And he is absolutely opposed to what is
very good. On. Very good.
Absolutely opposed. But here's the problem for your religious leaders. He says, if he speaks out as he wants to do and as he is doing, he risks his whole congregation.
Yeah, because part of them are supporting Putin. You're absolutely right.
But it's not only that. If they support him, he risks them being brought to jail. He risks them being hurt or their families.
Absolutely.
That's the situation in Russia that is just so horrible.
Very horrible, very horrible. I have seen, Joyce, statistics from Russia that I cannot believe, that how much support, this man has after every invasion. how the support increases in Russia. For example, when the two small republics or part of it, 20% of Georgia was taken by him.
Yeah.
The support increased. You know that Putin, before invading Chechnya, the KGB bombed a couple of apartments in Moscow, and the news for a couple of days, they were conveying that Chechens, they have done this crime, to prepare the ground for that that criminality that they entered into. And that is overall, Joyce, better than me, that is overall the things that the authoritarian regimes they resort to. They resort to misinformation, emotional appeal to people, and other things. Anyway, the man is in trouble. I really do not think the man, thought Ukraine is like a piece of cake. And it is not. It is just, Ukraine is a very strong, country. And Zelensky is a hero.
Yes,
hero.
Yes.
An international hero. They suggested to him to go out of the country and stay in Europe, and from Europe overall, oversee the situation over there. And he said, no, if I go to Europe, I cannot be with my own people. And he is in Ukraine, and that is a reason, because of one single man, the whole country is together at the moment.
Absolutely right.
And that is
perfect leader. He's been a perfect leader.
Really good leader.
Now let me ask you to think of something else. We all know, who've been watching this, Putin is guilty of war crimes. How likely do you think, looking back at history and other things, it is that he will ever be charged and have to be tried and become a Saddam Hussein standing before the world?
I hope so. The same as Serbian, of course, leaders. Milosevic and others. I hope one day. I heard in a couple of good news that the European courts at the moment are putting together the level of atrocities, and they are, of course, putting together documents. I hope that, can happen one day. Why? Not because of Putin, because of the people of the world to know, and the dictators, that if they participate in this kind of crime, there is one day that they have to pay for it. And I hope that Putin very much face that course one day. One day. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Either he will face that or he will die. That's basically the only two scenarios I see. But here's the other thing that we should really think about, that Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to leave, to in any way triumph. Because we've seen two things. We've seen the bravery, the courage, the just inspiration from the Ukrainian people and their leaders. But we've also seen how weak the rest of us are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Unable to help. The world has watched as people were massacred. And we did nothing.
You're absolutely right, Joyce, that this incident is an example that we have to really think about authoritarianism one more time, and predictability of those people, and the damage that they can inflict on the world. This is a huge damage. It is not only destroying a country, it's destroying a people, it's destroying overall, other part of the world. And the fear, you said it.
Destroying the world order.
The world order. Absolutely.
The world order. Absolutely. You cannot any longer go and invade another country. And think about toppling the government that they elected. That government is a sovereign government. That government is a government of the people, no matter how popular that government is. If you vote for a leader, that you vote within the term that that leader has, you can criticize, you can do all of those things, but that is a legitimacy in democratic system. You cannot question the legitimacy of sovereignty
in different parts of the world. Mr. Putin is running his country, of course, differently, 22 years, but that is not the case. That's not the case.
Well, Zach has a very good question. I want to get to his because, as you look at this, and if I were a young man, I would certainly be worried. Am I going to end up being in war, right? Look what we've left to our young people. But he asked, one of the common things he hears people talk about with the conflict is how widespread could it get? Are we at a point where the amount of involvement will lessen anytime soon, or will we see this thing, turn into a conflagration that will it be World War III?
I don't think so. I hope Erdogan, I don't like to know that one that much, but of course, Erdogan can really work it out in a sense.
Turkish recipe?
Yeah, I think so, because the face-to-face meeting, that was a face-to-face meeting that they had in Istanbul.
Right.
They could not solve all of the problem, but it was positive. Everybody, of course, is saying it is positive. And the more, of course, Putin stays in Ukraine, there are two dangers. One danger is that the more he fades, the more crazy he becomes. This is number one. Yeah. And number two, of course, on the other side of the coin, the more he loses, he will think about a way to go out. Both of them, the positive and the negative side. You have to think about it overall, that way. But the most important thing that we have to understand is this, that Joyce, you said it, he should not win in this battle. If Putin wins this battle, that is a win against democracy, that is a win against decency, that is against, of course, the win against, peace. And human beings' choice of, self-determination. And he should not be allowed overall to win in Ukraine. Joyce, something else that, I have to add over here. I really admire the Ukrainian outside. So far, 500,000 Ukrainian from the United States and Europe, they joined their countrymen in Ukraine to fight Russia.
Wow.
That is very, very amazing. That is amazing.
So Dr. Noorbaksh, again, I have to compliment you on the clarity and the insights you brought. But one final thing, and I did save the hardest one to last.
Yeah.
We've already talked about Putin can't be allowed to win. And if Putin must know how horrible he could end.
Yeah.
What about those nuclear weapons? Would he see are we dealing with a crazy man who would take the whole world down with him if he's going?
I don't think so. At the beginning of the war, he was threatening.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know it or not, 3 days ago, the spokesperson of the defense ministry came out and said, no, we do not use nuclear weapon unless we are threatened inside the Soviet Union. And that was very much a type of relief for a lot of people. I don't think so.
Did Lavrov say that?
No, not Lavrov. There was a spokesperson of the defense ministry. I forgot the name. I saw it on the news and I read about it. Because at the beginning, Putin twice, they threatened the world, of course, with nuclear weapon. Yeah. And he came out and overall, that was a positive thing to hear. But of course, that is, Putin, but Putin knows that the use of this kind of arm is very, very dangerous. Let me give you one example. When the United States and the Soviet Union at that time entered the Korean War in 1950s, they were directly, of course, supporting each side. United States had a more sophisticated nuclear arm because they were 4 years ahead of the Russia and the Soviet Union. But neither side threatened the other side with nuclear weapon because they knew the cost is very, very high. Even under the Soviet Union, they did not go to that length. there is a theory in using, of course, that kind of a R, and both countries are at this, parity. It is called mutually assured destruction. Right. That's a philosophy that if you overall, hit me, I have the potential, first strike capability, second strike capability, to inflict upon you even more overall, damage. Then each side knows in that, and that is overall, what the Biden administration and the European, of course, try to do to prevent the war to escalate further. That is overall, what they are trying to do.
My only hope is that there are saner people around him than he is, and that
Absolutely.
if he were to get to that level of insanity,
I hope so.
Then someone would be moved to act to save the earth. So I am going to once again
thank you very much, Joyce. Thank you very much.
Vice President of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, professor at the Harrisburg
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Acclaimed scholar. Thank you all for
Thank you very
joining
much
us tonight, and we'll see you next week when we're going to have Dr. Sanjay Paul from Elizabethtown College talking about ASEAN. So
thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Thank you.